Much of your mistakes in poker and your lack of ability to capture all the value really boils down to one particular thing. A huge percent does, and I would argue that many of the problems in the world boil down to this thing as well, and that is actually communication and clarity of thought. Now let me go into why. And even to my frustration, when I ask people reads on players or information on different players, they often tell me very vague answers, and I think it's largely a matter of inability to dive deeper. They will describe players as bad or tight or loose or just easy to play against. Well, let me tell you that all this is a big reason why many of you just aren't that great, and how this relates to all the problems out there in the world and where all the value is at a deeper level in pretty much anything in many fields you wouldn't expect. Like, I would argue dating, I would argue sex, I would argue martial arts too. We'll get into that in a second. But anyway, so in poker, first of all, if you describe someone as tight, this word actually has multiple different meanings. Its meaning is a little bit too general in this case. It can mean that someone has a tight range preflop. It can mean that someone folds too much later on in the hand. It can mean that someone doesn't bluff. It can mean any combination of all those. So you can see how very quickly this description of somebody really just doesn't describe them very well. Then if you describe someone as bad, well, that can mean all kinds of things. That can mean that they're just going all in preflop. That can mean that they just tilt like crazy. That can mean that they are opening way too many hands and just playing really loose passive. What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything as far as your ability to exploit them. And if you're thinking that you're playing GTO, let me tell you, I can tell from playing with lots of you guys do not understand the solvers at a deep level. I can tell you that. You guys aren't doing your homework in terms of looking at the fine detail in the solvers as well. So let's go into what this actually looks like to take advantage. Now, there should actually be multiple different words or rather descriptions there are in language, but it's better even to be more precise with your language when describing players, even to yourself. So, and this is where the edge actually comes from. It's like, okay, well, how are they tight? Are they not bluffing enough as I just described? Are they just tight preflop in the first place, which doesn't mean bad, by the way. It can be very hard to beat tight players. And what are the counters to that? Okay, this is going to get into what your progress in poker looks like, by the way, and how to get better and better. That would be the solution for that one. If they are someone who overfolds, obviously you bluff more, you add more bluffs. If there's someone who they do both, then you make both counters. If they open rarely preflop, you tend to 3-bet a bit more on the polar side. Ted is not opening much, then you would fold some of the worse high card type hands to them. You would 3-bet them a little bit less. You would just not mess with their opens too much. Conversely, if someone's opening too much, if they're loose in this way, then you would obviously rear-raise them more, especially if they don't 4-bet as much. So you can see how if you go into the details of language compared to the description of, okay, they're tight or they're bad or they're loose, you can see how now this becomes more useful for how to exploit them in various different kinds of ways, or where your edge will actually come from, an exploitative or even GTO play. Actually, this will now give some kind of answers to how you're winning, whereas if they just are playing GTO, you're not going to win too much. A big point of this really is to look at finer and finer details of truth and to essentially be more analytical, especially and to be more precise with what you're doing. And that's more or less where the value is. And generally speaking, the worst players on the whole just don't go a layer deeper. There are other layers as well, such as the psychological layer. If there's a meta game going on, if someone wants to play this game of like trying to be more action, that's one example. Or if they're at a final table and they're just likely to play tighter because they have their backers money and they really don't want to look stupid, that kind of thing. Or if they just lost a huge pot and that affects their game, or if it doesn't. Ideally, you want to know, and at the very least have an intuitive understanding, so you don't need a list. It's built into your mind through continuous exposure of what the different layers of someone's game are. I've listed in other videos, but one would be the population exploits, what's the general theme of the kinds of players you're playing against and how they respond to you. Another is the specific exploits. What are the details of the game, like similar to what I just talked about? How does that work with what you're doing? How are you countering all that? Obviously, there's the fundamentals. There's some live reads. Sometimes live reads skew things. There's the psychological layers we just talked about. There's the metagame layers. At some point, you have to consider the mental game, and even with that, there's sub-layers such as your nutrition, your sleep, if you've been drinking, if you're really stressed about something, what else is going on in your life, that kind of stuff. and how communication relates to all that is really more related to awareness and a lot to your internal awareness as to what's going on and how these various factors are affecting you. It would fall under a different category of communication, but in all cases, really, as precise and as closest to truth you really are, actually really does help you, especially then taking the next step and doing something with it, which I always describe. And this all falls under the umbrella of this mysterious thing that everyone, I presume, wants to have in order to be really good, of obsession. This is what it looks like, paying attention to every single detail. And then, of course, when we actually break down those layers, we go into play, and I try to describe this process a little bit to people. It's not just the bust out hand of the tournament that I know you guys are all crying over all the time on Twitter. I see it. It's all those decisions in the middle, such as if you're playing every single hand preflop right, if you're really serious, if what your other opponents are doing, what's the proper ICM for the various different situations if you're in a tournament, what's the c-betting strategy and what the rough sizing looks like on every flop, on ace king 6 or 2 6 7. I know you guys haven't been doing your homework. What the check back range looks like, or the attacking that looks like in both out of position and in position, if you should check more because they play like shit against that, or if you should bet more because they are over aggressive against that, or whatever it is. All decisions look roughly like that, and you should be thinking, okay, where can you get the most value? One of the difficult tricks, especially when you're in the beginning, is how to truncate these essentially never-ending trees of decisions and to create heuristics for what you should be doing. So an example would be, often against a lot of players, you just want to bet the flop and fast play. This is a common theme in poker. That's a heuristic that's often given to you. The reason for that is basically you don't get into a whole lot of strange trees later on against almost anyone else, and almost no one puts in loads of money anywhere as much as they do against versus a c-bet. So generally speaking, you just fast play your hands versus c-bet. So generally speaking, you just fast play your hands in the form of a c-bet and also versus a c-bet. That's why you also check raise and generally fast play it. It's a big reason anyway. There are the things that matter, such as like inevitably your value betting range is going to have to get thinner and thinner as you go later, at least in this specific example. But that's an example of a heuristic where you truncate a lot of the details and decide not to focus too much on them. This can of course change if all of a sudden you find a guy that just blasts away on the turn whenever you check back. Well, now all of a sudden it makes loads of sense to slow play, but that rarely happens. Another example of heuristics would fall into the category of preflop. You don't really need to have the perfect preflop game down unless you're playing against people that have mastered this specific type of poker that you're playing, like the classic form of no limit hold'em, often on GG, or no limit hold'em with one big blind ante. It's a very common format for tournaments. I think it's a little bit ridiculous and overdone. But once the game just changes even a little bit, no longer can you rely on these very, very precise details, and you need these heuristics in order to function properly. And that's when you need to have like what you consider a concept versus going deeper and deeper into the precision of things anyways. And this is where you need to start truncating the details such that you refer more to a general way of looking at things. That's what a heuristic is. So as an example, if the big blind was 2 antes instead of 1, you're going to play wildly looser. You probably use a heuristic such as you add 1 pip of suited hands. Now you need a limp. Now you need to limp like 1 pip wider or whatever it is after essentially like half an ante more. In this specific example, you would compare your preflop ranges to what they might look like in situations that closely resemble what you happen to be playing, such as it folds to you and you're in the small blind. You might compare that range to what you might play in the button or the cutoff, where there's a 2 big blind ante. And you may try to compare your strategy a lot more to that. And that is if you don't have the sims to go deep and study. And then you can even break down, okay, how's your approach towards this? If you need to get a bit more serious, okay, well, you need to study a number of things. And the biggest one would be you need to get the preflop ranges roughly for various different spots and then readjust according to that. Then use your knowledge of postflop in the situations where ring is 1 big blind ante to apply for how it looks like in this format where there's a 2 big blind ante. When you get to the point, if you built up your intuition to a degree in which it's strong enough that you're relying mostly on that rather than precise details of things, of individual hands, for example, or individual ranges to play, that's when you get to the point of smoothness. Smoothness has the property of we're not paying too close attention to very small levels of details that end up becoming tedious and making the overall experience too bad and making things quite a bit faster on the whole. And so an analogy with the smooth line that we're talking about is that they will draw a line that has the property of being smooth, but it does not have the property of being accurate. So obviously what the goal is to first focus on a lot of these fine details, understand where you can finally truncate because they have diminishing returns, and then gloss over to make sure that you have the right kind of shape. This requires both the analytical and the slow logical approach of looking at little things, and it requires the intuition to finally gloss over and create the shape. An easy way to understand this concept would be if someone was to just know the button range but not the under the gun range. For a basic format such as a one big blind ante, they're going to have a much worse time drawing or figuring out what the ranges are for a lot of the other positions without more points of reference they get, especially as they know the precision of the different ranges pre-flop. The points of reference being, okay, what do they play in the small blind? What do they play in the big blind versus an open? What do they play in the cutoff or the hijack? Now, if they have a lot of those, now they can guess where some of the gaps in between, especially as they gain more and more points of reference through playing more poker. Now they can get more of a picture of what the pre-flop looks like. The more points of reference, the better you're able to, quote unquote, draw the line of what the proper pre-flop strategy will look like. And that's basically how all heuristics work, except that a really big thing, on the whole, the general theme of where players are lacking and people are lacking is actually they don't go deep enough into the details to determine where they can be smooth and where they can't be. They rely too much on general ideas and in the wrong spots.